Hey everybody, and welcome to the Sim channel for the big review of the Fanatec DD1 wheelbase. First of all, since we've got a lot to cover, I divided this review into the following 6 chapters with timestamps in the description for you to jump to whatever interests you most. The thing itself is about the black box on a stick that is the DD1. Here we'll talk about the used materials, the build quality and reliability, but also its size and mounting solutions. The other things is about anything that you can in some way connect or attach to it. That means we'll talk about the available accessories, the Fanatic Eco System, and compatibility. In the features, we'll have a look at the quirks and features of the DD wheelbases and see what makes them stand out from other offerings on the market. This section is subdivided into a hardware and software chapter. The feels is about how the wheelbase performs in your hands. That means we'll take a look at its maximum force and other characteristics like fidelity and smoothness in this section. And finally, in the verdict and value, we'll recap the core observations of this review, discuss the price, and see how it stacks up against other offerings on the market. The thing itself is a big, beautiful, and heavy black box. The frame is a solid, powder-coated aluminum block, and the aluminum-made top and side panels stick to it with magnetic tape for easy removal. It has a golden shaft sticking out at the front end and a little OLED display right above that. The bottom and sides offer a variety of mounting solutions that should give you everything you need to mount it solidly into any cockpit. Unfortunately, no mounting brackets are included to put the wheel at the usual 10 to 15 degree angle, so depending on your rig you may have to get a little creative about how to achieve that. The backside features the power and USB jacks, power button, and a number of RJ12 jacks for all sorts of accessories from the Fanatic Eco System, plus the so-called torque key. The torque key is sort of a dongle that needs to be put in place in order to unlock forces above 8 Newton meters. Apparently this is a safety feature of some sort. Not sure how exactly it's making anything safer or why Fanatec didn't just opt for a switch though. One thing that sets the DD wheelbases apart from most but not all of the competition is the lack of an external box for the electronics. Instead, the electronics are placed inside the wheelbase, while the power supply is an external brick that is surprisingly modest in dimensions for the kind of power that the wheelbases offer. With respect to the used materials and build quality, at least on the outside of the base, there is nothing to complain about. Everything looks and feels very solid and durable. On the inside, the DD1 shares the motor with its larger sibling, the DD2. However, the two differ with respect to the electronics driving the motors. So no, the hardware is not identical between the two, it's not simply a software restriction, and yes, the DD2 will probably have a slightly better acceleration, as was explained by Fanatec founder Thomas Jackermeier in a video on Fanatec's YouTube channel. Nonetheless, the differences won't be very large, and from its specs, the DD1 promises to be quite a beefy piece of kit. By far, my biggest concern with this wheelbase is reliability. A common issue of the first generation DD bases seems to be failing power buttons that leave the wheel in sort of an always-on mode as soon and as long as they're connected to power. I've had this problem occur in my first unit and got a replacement unit via the RMA procedure. My second wheelbase unfortunately isn't without its issues either. The power supply doesn't shut itself off after the wheelbase is shut off and will often keep its fan running at a fairly noticeable volume until you pull the plug. Moreover, the new wheelbase has a slightly disconcerting clatter noise coming out of the fan at the rear end, and I'm currently preparing for my second RMA of the DD1 because of this. While both the power supply and fan are bought in parts from third parties, and the fix will be a simple swap of these parts, it's still 3 separate issues with a single product in the first 2 months. That seems a bit excessive, and I'm slightly concerned about the post-warranty cost I may face with this thing 2 years down the road. Of course, I have no statistics on the failure rates of Fanatec's DD1 wheelbases, so I could just be one of a few unlucky users, but to be fair, Fanatec has earned a bit of a reputation for reliability issues in the past. However, some issues are to be expected with the first revision of an all-new product, so there is hope that the reliability will eventually catch up. On a side note, Fanatec's RMA procedure requires you to send in your wheel first before they'll send out a new one, so you'll find yourself without a wheelbase for a couple of days if you have to RMA it. At least Fanatec's service team so far appears to be competent and helpful in taking care of these issues. So let's hope 3rd time's the charm and move on to some less depressing topics. In terms of accessories, there's the podium kill switch, which also serves as a second power button for the unit, at about 100 euros, and the podium mounting brackets at about 250 euros. The idea behind the kill switch is that if your wheel ever goes haywire, you push the big red button and all torque is cut off immediately. That being said, in about 2 months of regular use, I haven't had a single situation where a kill switch would have helped me in any way, but your mileage may vary. Whether or not you want or need the kill switch or the mounting brackets is up to you, but I believe it's fair to say that both are outrageously overpriced. On to the things that you can attach the DD1 to. It'll work with any regular Windows PC and comes with drivers for 32 and 64-bit systems. On the console side of things, all 3 Fanatec DD wheelbases are compatible with Xbox if and only if you have an Xbox-compatible steering wheel connected. The only wheelbase that will work on a PS4 though is the Podium Racing Wheel F1, which is essentially a DD1 in bluish carbon wrapping with a chip inside that makes it compatible with a PS4 on a hardware level. On the plus side, your choice of steering wheels for the PS4 is pretty much unlimited within Fanatec's offerings. It should be mentioned that if you're on a console, the Fanatics are currently your only option for a direct drive wheelbase, so we'll have to give them some credit for that. Finally, there's the Fanatic Eco System, which played a big role in my decision to buy the DD1. And by ecosystem, I'm mainly talking about the available Fanatec wheel rims, since pedals and shifters will connect directly to the PC and can thus be bought from any brand. The Fanatec Club Sport wheels, as far as I can tell, are all of decent quality and, with the exception of the Universal Hub, reasonably priced, helping to keep the total cost of a direct drive system in check. We'll revisit the topic of pricing towards the end of this video when we compare the value proposition to the competition. Alright, we're getting to the meat of this review and we'll start this one on a high note. The little OLED display on the front of the wheelbase is a feature that no other direct drive wheelbase on the market today has, and I've come to find it very useful. It lets you select one of 4 screens: the default screen with just a Fanatec logo, the force feedback analysis screen, the motor data analysis screen, and the temperature analysis screen. According to the manual, there should be a 5th screen called System Info, but that was apparently removed for the time being. The one that stands out here is the motor data analysis screen. It'll show you the fan speed and temperatures of the motor and driver, but these only really become relevant when you're using the wheel at very high settings for extended periods of time. What is interesting is the display of the current torque being put out by the wheelbase, the peak torque of the last 5 seconds, and the graph of the force feedback history of the last 5 seconds. Without a direct measurement, it would be quite tricky to determine the actual torque that's being delivered unless you run into clipping. I especially appreciate the 5 seconds peak torque figure, as it gives you an easy to read measure of the peak torques you're getting in each corner without any ifs and buts. I'd prefer to show the peak force of the last 10 seconds to give us a little more time to read after exiting a corner, but that's only a minor gripe. This feature can be useful in setting up the wheelbase to your liking, getting an intuition of the forces at play, and it lets me discuss the forces I'm using in this review without any guesswork on my end. Thumbs up to Fanatec for this feature. Next up, let's talk about the quick release system on the DD wheelbases. On the end of the wheelbase, it has 3 main parts: the front end of the shaft with a rubber ring at its rear end, a loose aluminum ring, and a nut that will fasten the assembly by pushing the loose ring against the rubber, making it expand outward to tighten up the connection between the quick release and the shaft. On the plus side, the system works and it really does hold the wheels firmly in place without any slip. However, it's not as quick as the name suggests, and there is no precise point at which you know to stop turning. You just kind of keep going until you think it's probably enough. Other systems on the market may have more satisfying solutions from a mechanical standpoint, but the system allows the Fanatec system to run the communication lines through the shaft that provide functionality to buttons and shifters. In other words, thanks to the system, you don't need a separate cable or a potentially unreliable Wi-Fi connection. Overall, even though it probably isn't the perfect solution, it does its job and can do without an extra cable, so another thumbs up for Fanatec. Finally, a bit of criticism about the design of the DD wheelbases. At a total length of 33 cm without any wheel attached, they are fairly long already. Since the air vents are placed on the rear, you have to leave another 10 cm of space behind it before the screen. For a person with average arm length and sitting at the recommended distance from the wheel, this results in a lower bound for the eye-to-screen distance of about 90 cm. If I get closer to the wheel, my seating position will be awkward, and if I put the screen on top of the wheelbase, the horizon will be too close to the bottom of the frame, or we'll get in trouble with the FOV police. Remember, the horizon should always be at or slightly below eye level. Since you need access to the QR system's nut and probably want to be able to see the wheelbase's OLED display, you also can't place the screen between the wheelbase and the wheel itself. In consequence, this means go big, go triples, go VR, or learn to live with a narrow field of view. On the software side of things, we're still waiting for the new Fanatic control suite, which is supposedly even capable of turning game telemetry into force feedback effects. For now, we're left with a basic calibration and software version management tool. However, the wheelbase's firmware lets us set up a number of parameters in the wheel itself that are then stored to one of the 5 setup slots the wheelbase provides. 5 slots means that if you want individual settings per game and class of car, you may be running out of slots quickly. The upcoming control suite is supposed to fix that, providing you with 5 setup slots per game. Until then, if you need more than 5 different presets in total, you'll have to note them down and dial them in when you need them. To be honest though, this is a small inconvenience but not a big problem overall. Personally, I only ever adjust 3 to 4 of the parameters anyway, and that's a rather quick thing to do. But let's discuss why we want or need those parameters in the first place. In a perfect world, the simulator you're using would simulate the car's complete steering assembly, including power steering, friction, and damping. The game would put out the exact forces that the real car would put on the steering wheel as well. But we don't live in that perfect world. I'm not sure how other sims do it, but at least in the case of Assetto Corsa, it was stated publicly that the force feedback calculation is very simple, with no power steering simulated, and I'm assuming no friction either. Now the wheelbase can in principle make up for this lack of realism to a degree and let us get closer to a realistic steering feel for the highest levels of immersion. The really interesting settings in my eyes are the natural damper and natural friction. The natural damper makes it harder to turn the wheel the faster you turn it. It is recommended to set this to the lowest value you get away with without getting notable oscillations on the straights or in standstill. Natural friction, on the other hand, will essentially put honey into the gears, making it harder to turn the wheel away from its current position for both you, the driver, as well as the game's force feedback signal. In contrast to the natural damper, it feels like a constant resistance force and does not change with the rotational speed of the wheel. When set with care, this setting can make the steering feel a lot more realistic, especially for road cars. The wheel will feel a little more sluggish as well, but in the real world, at least road car steering wheels are in fact often kinda sluggish, something that isn't simulated well in many sims. Thumbs up for Fanatic for this setup option. I'd say it's probably advisable to leave most or all other settings outside of these two and the force feedback gain at the values recommended by Fanatic for the game in question. Use the damper to get rid of any unwanted oscillations, then use gain and friction to achieve the steering feel you desire. Now, these setup options are great to have on board, but if I were to make a wish, it would be to provide us with some sort of power steering simulation in the wheel for those sims that don't, which I believe is most or even all of them to date. The recently released Simucube 2 has a feature that goes somewhat in this direction, called static force reduction. If I understand it correctly, the setting applies sort of a high-pass filter, taking away some of the high cornering forces while leaving road noise, bumps and rumble intact, similar to what many power steering systems will end up doing. I'd really like to see a feature like that on the Fanatec DD wheelbases as well, ideally even extended to provide a selection of different power steering profiles, since these come in some variety in the real world. However, Simucubes say that the faster processor in the Simucube 2 is what's really enabling them to offer this filter, so I can't say whether or not a filter of this kind can even run on the Fanatec wheelbases. Probably most interesting to many is the question how the DD1 feels when driving. Instead of throwing a bunch of flowery, but in the end meaningless descriptions your way, let's do this part a bit more technical by looking at the characteristics that are relevant with respect to sim racing. These characteristics are the torque, acceleration, smoothness, and to some degree the rotational speed. We'll start with smoothness just to get this topic out of the way. The DD1 feels pretty smooth, yet when turning it in idle, you will feel a slight hint of steps. So it isn't 100% smooth in that scenario, and other wheels such as the blunders may have a slight advantage in this regard. However, this issue is rather minimal and I've never really noticed it while driving until I specifically paid attention to it for this section of the review. The little steps in the rotation also come with a little bit of friction, but overall the friction is still very low. Bottom line, this is a non-issue. Moving on. The maximum rotational speed of the shaft is, to the best of my understanding, only really relevant up to a degree. We simply don't need the rotational speed to be faster than the fastest we experience in the real world. My best guess is that, outside of crashing the car, we reach these in drifting when we let the wheel rotate freely, maybe after we've given it a bit of a tug in the direction of rotation. Highly relevant, on the other hand, is the acceleration of the wheel. How quickly the rotational speed of the wheel can increase in one direction or the other can be felt directly, and this is often referred to as the precision, sharpness, detail, fidelity, or resolution of the force feedback. This is also the part that many users of direct drive wheels praise the most in comparison to lesser wheels. So how does the DD1 do in these regards? Well, in the initial unveil of the DD wheelbases, Fanatec gave us a bit of a glimpse into that by showing us this plot. Unfortunately, the resolution of the stream was a bit low and it has since been taken down from Facebook and/or YouTube. Luckily, I made a screenshot at the time to discuss it with a friend and was able to retrieve it from that chat. The x-axis is time and the y-axis is the rotational speed in revolutions per minute, going from 0 to 350 in increments of 50. In green, you see when the signal to rotate at maximum speed was given. The yellow line is labeled hybrid stepper, which is very likely referring to the AccuForce steering wheel. In blue, you see the CSW 2.5. The gray line is labeled 26 Nm servo, which is very likely a reference to the largest Bodnar sim steering wheelbase with the Kollmorgen AKM 54 motor. Finally, the orange line is a Fanatec DD wheelbase, probably the DD2. So what do we see here? The Fanatec DD has the highest rotational speed by some margin, which, as mentioned before, I would consider largely irrelevant. Interestingly, its acceleration looks to be very similar to the Bodnar 26 Nm wheelbase, and clearly superior to the CSW 2.5 and AccuForce. Of course, as this graph comes from Fanatec, it's to be taken with a grain of salt, and we have to factor in that the DD1 probably has a slightly weaker acceleration than the DD2, as was mentioned by Thomas Jackermeier of Fanatec in one of the early DD videos on Fanatec's channel. Still, the differences are supposedly small, after all they do use the same motor, and we can assume that both of them perform rather similarly in that regard. This graph supports my impression that the quote-unquote big direct drive wheelbases feel pretty similar to one another. When testing them back to back, I believe that experienced drivers will probably be able to feel a difference between the DD1, DD2, the Bodnars, OSWs, and Simucubes, but I expect these differences to be somewhere between small and negligible. In his impressions video from the Fanatec community event held last year, James West, aka Gamer Muscle, said the differences between the DD1, DD2, OSWs, and Bodnars were very subtle, with these wheels kind of playing in their own bracket and above all other wheelbases on display at the event. From what I remember of driving the large and small Bodnar at Heusinkveld 2 years ago, I'm inclined to agree with that statement, and I talked to William Marsh of the Sim Racing Paddock, who said the DD2 is, quote, pretty darn close to the Simucubes. In the end, I believe it will mostly be down to other aspects than the raw capabilities of the motors when it comes to making a decision between these high-end direct drive wheelbases. One of these points may be the total amount of torque the wheel can provide, which, after all, is the main differentiator between the DD1 and DD2 wheelbases. The DD1 comes with a holding torque of 50 Nm and a peak torque of 20 Nm, while the DD2 has a holding torque of 20 Nm and a peak torque of 25 Nm. Most other manufacturers will only report the peak torque, so in line with the numbers provided by everybody else, the DD1 is a 20 Nm base, and the DD2 is a 25 Nm base. Fanatec did say that the holding torque is the more relevant number, but I'm gonna cautiously disagree with that after having tested it myself. I set the wheel gain to 100% and set the gain in Assetto Corsa to a value that would then induce notable clipping about 3 to 4 times a lap on Donington. With lap times of around 1 minute and 5 in the chosen 2017 911 RSR, we can say the 20 Nm figure was reached about 3 times per minute, with much of the rest of the lap still demanding a lot of torque, hardly ever giving the wheelbase a rest. I drove this combo for about an hour in a relatively warm room, windows closed and no extra fans. In this test, the motor reached a maximum of 79 degrees Celsius and the driver went up to 74 degrees, making the DD1 feel pretty warm on the outside. The fans of both the DD1 and the power supply got pretty loud, but the motor consistently reached its torque limit of about 20 Nm lap after lap for the whole duration of the test. It can still be the case that the maximum torque output decreases after longer driving sessions, but I was already driving the wheel with about 10 to 20% more gain than I usually would, just to make sure I consistently run into heavy clipping and get the desired 20 Nm figure on the display. So now that we've established that the DD1 is, for all intents and purposes, a 20 Nm wheelbase, let's talk about whether or not this is enough. We leave the influence the overall torque has on the fidelity of the force feedback out of this and just focus on the raw force. A popular opinion on this matter seems to be that you're physically not going to be able to deal with 20 Nm peak torque under cornering for extended periods of time, or that you'll at least have very little control over the car at those levels of force. After all, you've probably seen people do the 100% force feedback challenge on YouTube, so you may be convinced that these kinds of forces are out of the question for any sustained driving activity. So what if I told you that in race cars without power steering, peak forces between 18 and 25 Nm are the norm? I've linked you a master thesis that includes steering torque measurements on a 2014 Formula 3 car, the Dallara F3 driven on the Circuit de Catalunya in Barcelona. Peak torque in most corners is about 18 Nm here and a little over 20 Nm in one corner. Then there's a conference paper by a member of the Newman Haas racing team from 2000 simulating how the steering forces of an Indy car on an oval change as a function of setup changes. This one puts the torque in the 15 to 20 Nm region for Indy cars on an oval. I'm also linking you an article about a 2012 test drive Dario Franchitti did in a Dallara DW12 in mid-Ohio, specifically to assess what forces drivers have to deal with in these cars. Steering forces here were up to 35 pounds or about 16 kilograms combined for both hands. To calculate the corresponding torque, we need to multiply these 160 newtons by the diameter of the steering wheel, which should roughly be in the 29 centimeter region, giving us about 23 Newton meters of steering torque for a 2012 Indy car. Finally, for those of you who are interested, I'm linking a video in which Niels Heusinkveld demonstrates how you would calculate the steering forces in a simulation with the example of Racer's Formula V12. He gets to about 28 Newton meters of torque at peak self-aligning levels and about 24 Newton meters of torque at peak grip levels for that particular car and setup. Bottom line is, if you want to simulate the true forces of non-power steering race cars, you're gonna want at least a 20 Newton meters wheel, if not more. Yes, it's gonna be a bit of a workout, and you might even want to factor it into your workout routine at the gym if you want to do regular 2-hour stints above 20 Newton meters peak force, but it's certainly not like it can't be done. On a side note, most modern race cars, including F1, GT3 and LMP cars, come with power steering, allowing the teams and drivers to set up the amount of assistance they get. From what I've heard, most choose to use rather high levels of assistance, resulting in low steering forces, probably in the 4 to 8 Newton meter range for most corners. But even if you don't want to simulate non-power steering race cars, there are arguments to be made in favor of having larger amounts of torque at your disposal. For one, the steering wheel diameter is a determining factor in how much force you actually have to apply to the wheel to turn it, or just keep it steady in a turn. 10 Newton meters of torque on the steering column results in 74 newtons or 7.4 kilograms on a 27 centimeter wheel. To get the same steering forces on a 32 centimeter wheel, you'll need to put 11.85 Newton meters of torque on the steering column, since the wheel diameter is 18.5% larger. And then there's what I call the Eau Rouge effect. On some tracks you have corners that stand out from the rest in terms of steering forces, for example due to large amounts of compression or banking that allow you to pull higher Gs than anywhere else. To get through these without clipping and still have the desired amount of steering torque on the rest of the track, you're gonna need some headroom. This is actually the very reason I never liked driving on Spa much with my old T500. I've always had to make a choice between ridiculous clipping in Eau Rouge and having lush force feedback everywhere else. Now with the DD1, Spa has become one of my absolute favorites. To put in some numbers here, my comfort zone for steering torque in most regular corners is in the 11 to 12 Newton meter region on my 32 centimeter Porsche Cup wheel. With the forces dialed in to achieve these figures, I'm getting up to 60 Newton meters in Pouhon and Blanchiment and around 20 Newton meters of torque through Eau Rouge. All this at torque levels that I'm comfortable driving for hours. The bottom line is that the amount of torque you want or need is very much up to your personal preferences and physical constitution, your used wheel rims, as well as the cars and even tracks you're aiming to simulate. Yes, 20 Newton meters is plenty and will suffice for most drivers, but even 25 or 28 Newton meters peak torque figures are nothing I would call ridiculous or unreasonable. To be able to set up the wheel for realistic forces in non-power steering cars and still get through Eau Rouge without clipping, you may want to look at the SimuCube 2 Ultimate with its whopping 32 Newton meters of peak torque. Last but not least, let's talk a bit about the differences between my belt-driven T500 wheelbase and the DD1. The difference in precision, both in force feedback and the reading of the steering input, is immense, and it's a bit like going from a spring potentiometer brake to a full-blown load cell pedal. The increased forces make the driving much more physical, involving and immersive. You can very distinctly feel the wheel getting heavier as you increase the steering angle, then getting lighter again as you move over the hump of peak self-aligning force towards peak grip. If you don't know what I'm referring to here, take a look at Niels Heusinkveld's video I linked in the description. A direct drive wheel also helps you to faster correct any occurring oversteer and makes it much easier to keep the twitchier cars on track. To me, this wasn't something that I distinctly felt on a sensational level. Instead, I rather noticed that I made way fewer mistakes and was able to catch a lot of slides I previously wouldn't have been able to. The wheel is quicker to respond and appears to stay in sync with the self-aligning forces in-game. The T500 I was using before, by comparison, didn't seem to keep up with what the game was telling it to do when the rear stepped out. Overall, it made it rather easy to just drive through the steering forces and sort of disregard them. This is no longer the case with a direct drive wheel at high forces, and you will no longer accidentally brush over the steering angle you want or need. I believe that it's also made me faster by a couple of tenths a lap, depending on the car and track of course, simply because I can position the car more precisely and drive it more confidently, knowing that the wheel will help me correct a lot of the minor slides and other mistakes without me actively intervening by getting out of the throttle. All of this really makes the thought of ever going back to belt-driven wheels quite uncomfortable for me. And with that, we've covered all of the major points of this review. Let's quickly recap the pros and cons of the DD1 wheelbase before we discuss its pricing, competition, and I give my final verdict. Let's start with the pros. It has a beautiful and relatively compact design with integrated electronics. The OLED display on the front is surprisingly useful. The Fanatic DD wheelbases are the only direct drive wheelbases with console compatibility. The Fanatic Eco System offers an affordable entry into the direct drive wheel market. The quick release system does away with the need for a wire for shifter and button box functionality. The firmware provides a number of useful setup parameters, including friction. On a hardware level, the DD1 has everything it needs to compete with the OSWs, Simucubes, and possibly even Boatnars out there, getting it into the top bracket of direct drive steering wheels. The motor has acceleration figures supposedly similar to the Boatnar 26Nm wheelbase, and a decent peak torque of 20 Nm. It reaches this torque limit consistently with no weaknesses for at least an hour, even in high demand settings. Finally, from my experience, Fanatic's service seems competent and helpful. And the cons are? Unfortunately, Fanatic did not include any mounting brackets to put the base at an angle for cockpits that require that. The optional kill switch and mounting brackets are overpriced. The quick release system is not as quick and solid from a mechanical point of view as some of the other QR systems on the market. The rotation of the wheel isn't 100% smooth, although this is only a very minor complaint, and the air vents on the rear increase the closest distance to place a monitor by 10 cm. Before the arrival of the new Fanatic Control Suite software, there is only a total of 5 preset slots, which feels a bit on the low side. The DD1's reliability seems at least somewhat questionable. And as the last minor point of criticism, the Fanatic RMA procedure requires you to send in your wheelbase before they send out the replacement, leaving you without a wheelbase for a couple of days. So, with all of that said, is it worth the money? The price for all DD1 wheelbases ordered before May 7th, 2019 was €999 in the EU. Those who pre-ordered before the initially planned release date in December 2018 received an additional €350 voucher for the Fanatic webshop, resulting in an effective price of about €650. Needless to say that this was a spectacular deal, even if it meant waiting a few months longer than initially expected. Without the voucher at €999, the DD1 was still priced very competitively, especially if we factor in the good value proposition of some of the Club Sport wheels, such as the Fanatic Formula rims or the BMW GT2 rim. On May 7th, the price was increased to $11.99, and the warranty was extended to 3 years from the initial 2. At this price, one of the main competitors for the DD1 is the DD2 at $14.99. It offers 5 Nm more torque, 2 years more warranty, an included kill switch, and a set of carbon fiber panels as a visual differentiator at a €300 premium. At their current pricing, and because of the Arouge effect, as well as my experience with the reliability, I'd say the DD2 has a slight edge over the DD1 in terms of the value proposition. But how do these stack up against the competition? In this price range, some of the main competition to the Fanatic DD wheelbases are the Simplicity SW20 V3 and other wheelbases based on the small 20 Nm midge motor at about €1,000 shipped. The Simplicity SW30 and other wheelbases based on the large 30 Nm midge motor at about €1,200 shipped. The Simucube 2 Sport, a 70 Nm wheelbase at an MSRP of €1,270. and the SimuCube 2 Pro at 25 Nm wheelbase at an MSRP of €1,470. All of these are competitive offerings, but the most direct competitor to the DD1 in what I would describe as the second gen of direct drive wheelbases would be the SimuCube 2 Sports, which, just like the DD1, seems to be priced ever so slightly on the high side, given its slightly weaker maximum torque figure of 70 Nm. The more compelling offering, in my eyes, is the SimuCube 2 Pro, which seems to be a strong competitor for the DD2, coming with promises of class-leading fidelity, extreme ruggedness, and stellar reliability. In my eyes, especially the SimuCube 2 Pro may hit a nerve with many in the sim racing community. Nonetheless, the Fanatic direct drive offerings are compelling and have a couple of aces up their sleeves. With a console compatibility and a solid ecosystem already in place, they are the first to bring direct drive technology into the sim racing mainstream, with positive effects for other direct drive users as well. With a rapidly growing installed base of direct drive wheels in the community, and hopefully also in developer studios, we can expect sim developers to take this segment of the market more serious than ever before and give greater consideration to the needs and wishes of direct drive users in the way they approach force feedback in their simulations. And with that, we're at the end of this video. Thanks for sticking with me till the end of this review. A lot of work has gone into this, and if you enjoyed it, please leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel for more sim racing related content like this in the future. Thank you very much for watching, have a good rest of your day, and see you in the next video.